Today's lesson is about the respiratory system anatomy and physiology. But first, let's cover the anatomy of the respiratory system. So, as before we did with the digestive system, I like to sketch the anatomy myself. But let's take a look at this 3D torso model that I have at home. So you could actually feel, you could feel your neck here. We call it the Adam's apple, which is really the cricoid cartilage. So this is a cartilage right here in the shape of a letter C. And cartilage is basically a soft bone. So it's not a bone, not like your other bones, 206 of them in your body. Cartilage is more like the, when you touch your ears, your earlobe is, the upper earlobe is cartilage. So it's like soft bone. And this is the trachea. You could feel it on your neck. This cartilage here is sticking out, so that leads into the trachea. And the trachea will split into two primary bronchi, bronchus left and right, and it will then split into secondary bronchus inside the lungs, you can't see it, and then into the tertiary bronchus, and eventually leading into the air sacs or the alveoli, where air is brought in as you breathe in, and as you breathe out, that's where the air comes from. Before we get into the anatomy of the respiratory system, I just want to remind you of the cavity, since we have this model here, the cavity of the human body. So really you have the head, the cranial cavity. So you have the cranial cavity here that contains your brain, and then you have the cardiothoracic cavity here, the thorax, which is the chest cavity. This is the thoracic cavity. And then you have here, there is a structure that separates the thoracic and the abdominal cavity here, and that is called the diaphragm. And so you have your abdominal cavity. Abdominal cavity contains your digestive system. And then you have another opening here, which is your pelvic cavity, and that contains your reproductive organs. So these are the four cavities in the body in terms of the anatomy. Okay, so let's now take a look at the thoracic, the chest cavity. And if you take a look at the starting here, again, the nose, you can breathe through the nose, you can also breathe through your mouth. They're all connected in a kind of like a cave in the throat, and that leads down into the trachea. So I'm going to start with the trachea here. So remember that the trachea has the epiglottis that prevents, this is the lid that prevents the food particles from entering the lungs. And these are very sturdy, rigid C cartilage. So it's in the form of a letter C. This is the trachea. So the trachea is the windpipe, and it brings the air down. And the esophagus, by the way, is just right behind the trachea, and that is where the food will go. And of course, when the food is being swallowed, the epiglottis here will close the trachea, so then it protects the trachea from the food particles. This trachea then will divide into, and of course it gets softer as you get into the smaller parts of the windpipe. This is the primary bronchus. Now bronchus if you have one, bronchi if you have two. Let's take a look at the anatomy in terms of the right side and the left side, you could imagine this person here, this torso model, is facing me, it's facing you. So the right side of this person's body would be this, and that is my left side. So if you're looking at a drawing, this would be the right side, and this is the left side. So this would be the left primary bronchus, and this would be the right primary bronchus. Now this is going to split up into secondary bronchus. Again, this would be the left secondary bronchus, and that would be this is also the primary bronchus. So the left, I'm going to label this left primary, left secondary bronchus. This is the right primary bronchus. This is the right secondary bronchus. And then, of course, this will further split into tertiary. And now we are inside the lungs. So the lungs, I'm going to draw the lungs. So this is the right side. It goes like somewhat like that. And the right side has 3 lobes. So there's 1, 2, and 3. Whereas the left side only has 2 lobes. And you could see here in my drawing that the left lung is smaller than the right lung. Why do you think that is? What is here in the middle? Well, that is the heart. It's a different system, but the heart works, of course, with all the organs in the body to pump the blood all over to every single cell. So this is slightly, even though it's at the center of your chest, just behind the sternum or the chest plate, this is tilted slightly to the left side of the body. And this part right here is called the cardiac notch. So it's taking up space. So of course the left lung is gonna be smaller. Okay, so we have the lungs now, the bronchus. Okay, and it further splits into smaller ones. This is now that's still the left side. This is now called the tertiary bronchus. So those are after the secondary. This is now still the right side, tertiary bronchus. And these tertiary bronchus will lead into those, they look like clusters of grapes. So they'll have clusters of grapes here, and of course they will lead into those all the way to the bottom of the lungs everywhere. And these clusters of grapes, there's a lot of them, and they are microscopic, so you can't see them. They're like tiny balloons, and these are the air sacs. And let's label them. These are the alveoli. Alveolus for one, and these are the alveoli. And you got lots of alveoli in your lungs. This is where the air goes. They're everywhere. Okay, so the main parts of your respiratory system, okay, is the trachea, which split into the primary bronchus, left and right, and further split into secondary bronchus, left and right, and then the tertiary bronchus, and the lungs. And the lobes of the lungs are made up of alveoli, and alveoli are the sacs or tiny balloons where the air goes in. Okay, there's a lot more to this labeling, but for now, this is the main path of the air as you breathe in and out as well. So through this structure, the epiglottis, into the trachea, the primary bronchi, secondary bronchi, tertiary bronchi, and finally the alveoli. Now let's take a look at the lungs itself. So when you look at the lungs, so the lungs, I'm gonna kind of redraw one of them here. So here is the lungs. Oh, okay, well, right there. The skin of the lung, so basically the membrane that is on the coat that coats the lung. That's a rather bad drawing there, but oh well. This is called the pleura. So pleura is the skin of the lungs on the outside. So this is surrounded by pleura. That's the skin of the lungs. And there is, so there's a second layer here. So the pleura, there's a space right here. And so when you breathe in, when your lungs get larger and fill with air and expand, you are basically not going to collapse. So it's double layer. And there's also liquid inside, not liquid, sort of a substance that prevents the friction so that the membranes are not rubbing together and damaging your lungs. So that is the pleura, which is the outside layer. And as you can see here, the heart is taking up space, so it's facing slightly to the left, and that makes the right lung with 3 lobes larger than the left lung, which only has 2 lobes. So that is, if you can sketch the respiratory system, those are the main parts. Now, before I forget, okay, so this is the right side. The right side of the lung has 3 lobes, and the upper lobe is called the superior, the highest one. This is the superior lobe. The middle one is called the median lobe. And the one underneath, below, is called the inferior lobe because it's the lowest one. So as you can see here, the right lung has 3 lobes, whereas the right lung has 3 lobes, and the left lung only has 2 lobes. So it's just the upper and the lower. So superior lobe and the inferior lobe. It doesn't have a median lobe. Okay, again, because the heart is taking up space. So let's take a look at the anatomy in details now. The nasal cavity is the usual entrance for the outside air, and there is an advantage to breathing through your nose. Of course, you can breathe through your mouth as well, but as you can experience, the nasal cavity or the nose would be the preferred entry for the air because it has advantages such as it moistens the air as you inhale it. It has hairs inside. Your nose hair actually serves a purpose. So when you breathe in the air, the nostrils, the nose itself has hair, the nose hair, and it prevents the larger particles from entering your nasal passage. And of course, some of them will still get in, like the smaller bacteria, the viruses, of course. And that is where we have the mucus lining, okay, and the cilia inside the trachea and the bronchi. And when they get irritated, of course, you will cough or sneeze them out. So breathing air through your nose will moisten the air, and it will filter the air and warm it up. So 3 things happen when you breathe through your nose. It moistens, filters, and warms up the air before it reaches the lungs. Whereas when you breathe through your mouth, those 3 things don't usually happen. Okay, so many of the cells which produce the cells that make up the membrane contain cilia. So the cilia are the tiny little hair-like structure that sweep your tubes, and the tubes are coated with a sticky fluid called mucus, and the cilia and the mucus together work together to remove the particles that shouldn't be in your lungs. So again, those are your defense mechanisms. So it's better to breathe through your nose because it moistens, it filters, and warms the air before it reaches your lungs. Now, within in your head, you have these sinuses. Sinuses are hollow spaces in the bones of the head. So this is inside our skull. And what they're for, there are small openings that connect them to the nose. They are for helping regulate the temperature and the humidity of the air that we breathe in. So basically, those tiny holes within our head, they are there so that we can warm the air or cool it down if in the summer, if it's very, very hot, or if you're out there in the desert. And it moistens, it adds humidity. So it warms they serve two purposes. Again, they warm and they moisten the air. So those are done by the sinuses. Sometimes, however, when we get infected by bacteria or viruses or any other particles in allergic reactions, those sinuses can be flooded or fill with mucus. So the extra mucus, again, is our body's attempt to trap and remove those microparticles that shouldn't be in our lungs. However, when they do get overwhelmed with mucus, the sinuses can get inflamed, and we call it sinusitis. So sinusitis is when you get stuffed up, and if it's infected, it can be overwhelmed with bacteria, and that is again when you have bacteria infection, you may need an antibiotic. So when air enters through the mouth, the oral cavity, especially when you're panting, you may need to have an extra entry for air so that you can bring in the oxygen rapidly into your cells. The adenoids are lymph tissue at the top of the throat. So this is another structure that is a defense mechanism for our respiratory system. So the adenoids are in your throat. So when you're sick and the healthcare professional that you're seeing looks into your mouth and looks and say so then you can say so your tongue can be lower and your uvula can sort of get out of the way. They are looking at the adenoids and the tonsils if they are infected with something. So when the enlarged adenoids interfere with breathing, they may have to be surgically removed. So the lymph system, consisting of nodes and connecting vessels, carries fluid throughout the body. The adenoids helps to resist body infection by filtering out the foreign matter, including germs and the lymphocytes to fight them. So those particles that infect us, like the bacteria and the viruses, they can sometimes be collected in the adenoids and instead of getting into the lungs. So adenoids is one of the ways that we can prevent those small microparticles from entering the lungs. So of course, again, you look at the path of air. So they get filtered by the nose hair and then the cilia and then the phlegm or the mucus. And if they still get in there, in your throat, are adenoids that will actually collect those particles instead of having them go into the lungs. The tonsils are lymph nodes in the wall of the throat, and they're usually on the sides of the throat there, and they can become infected. And they're also part of the germ-fighting system of the body, part of your immune system. So adenoids and the tonsils. If the adenoids and the tonsils continue to become inflamed chronically, meaning a lot of all the time, they may have to be removed. So if the person keeps getting enlarged adenoids and tonsillitis, they may have to be surgically removed so that you're not always getting irritated and getting a cold and a cough and getting sick all the time. And we know the epiglottis is the entrance to the trachea that closes when anything is swallowed. Then you have the larynx. Larynx is just a fancy name for the voice box, and it contains the vocal cords. So this thing vibrates. I'm going to show you a film later on about the larynx and how it works in producing the different sounds that we make as we speak and sing or make noise. The larynx or the voice box is constructed mainly of cartilage, again just like your earlobe, the upper earlobe, which is a flexible connective tissue like a soft bone. The vocal cords are two pairs of membranes that are stretched across the inside of the larynx, and these vibrations and the opening of the larynx basically results in different pitch or frequency of the sound that comes out of our lungs. Then we get into the trachea as the windpipe. Basically, it's about 12 centimeters in length and 2.5 centimeters wide. So it's about an inch. So 2.5 is 1 digit finger on your finger. So 1 inch wide. So it's pretty wide if you think about that. And it's about 12 centimeters in length. So 12 centimeters. So it's, if I were to get something that is, so it is about it's about 12 centimeters. So 2.54 centimeter in an inch. So 12 divided by 2.54, it's about 5 inches. So this is about 5 inches in length. So that is the trachea. So it's about 1 hand length. So the length of your palm, this 12 centimeter. And again, if you were to measure it on your throat here, this trachea, if you take your hand and put it by just underneath your chin and to the end of your palm, that is where the trachea ends, which is the center of your chest plate, the sternum right here. So the trachea right here is about 5 inches long, the length of your palm on your hand, and it starts to split into the primary bronchus and into the secondary and tertiary and into the alveoli of your lungs. So that's about 5 inches long, about the palm of your hand. Okay. It's good to know in terms of what they look like and how long or how big they are, so you can relate that with your own body. So the trachea is kept open by rings of cartilage in the shape of the letter C. So this is soft here, but the letter C is called a C cartilage because it has to have ability to expand and contract as you breathe in. And also the C cartilage here is enough to basically keep it open. Now, why is it soft on the back here? Why is it a C cartilage? Well, it has to be soft because remember, what's behind the trachea is the esophagus. The esophagus is undergoing peristalsis because when you swallow food, this muscular contraction pushes the food down into your stomach. So it has to be soft on the side that is facing the esophagus. And this C cartilage has to be rigid and hard so it keeps your trachea open at all times. So similar to the nasal passages, the trachea is covered with cilia and mucus, again, to trap the particles that shouldn't be there. All right, the trachea divides into two main bronchi, the right bronchus and the left bronchus. And again, it goes from primary, secondary, tertiary, and then eventually they become bronchioles. These bronchioles are the tiny, tiny little tubes that connect directly into a bunch of grapes-like looking alveoli. The lymph nodes of the lungs are found against the walls of the bronchial tubes and the trachea. Okay, again, the lymph nodes have to do with your defense mechanism, your immune system, fighting all these particles that shouldn't be there. And of course, okay, so when you breathe in and out, the lungs are not muscular at all. There are no muscles in your lungs here. It's just a very thin membrane, one cell layer thick, so that you are able to diffuse the air in and out of the lungs. So how are you able to move your air in and out? Well, because the lungs don't have any muscles, nor the trachea, you need muscles to move the lungs. And this is done by the diaphragm right here underneath the lungs. So the diaphragm serves two purposes. It separates the thoracic cavity, the chest cavity, from the abdominal cavity, but it also is a very strong muscle that moves the lungs upwards as you breathe out or exhale, and lower, the diaphragm will lower to make more room for the lungs to expand or get bigger as you inhale or you bring the oxygen in. So that's done by the diaphragm, also by the rib muscle, the rib cage here. So those two muscles are the muscles that support the breathing. So ribs as well as the diaphragm. So those two sets of muscles are called the breathing muscles. Okay, we talked about the pleura. The pleura are the two membranes that separate the lungs from the chest wall. So that way, when you are breathing, the lungs don't rub against the rib cage, and that would be disastrous if that happens, and you'll puncture your lungs every time you take a breath. So the pleura is a protection from getting your lungs damaged as you breathe in and out. The interpleural fluid is the one, so here's your lungs. There's the pleura. The pleura is the skin that protects your lungs from breaking. It's a two-layer. What's in between the two-layer? The lung itself, this is the lungs, and the skin is filled with interpleural fluid between the two layers and functions to reduce the friction. The bronchial tubes are lined with cilia, very, very tiny microscopic hair with wave-like motion that carries mucus upward and out into the larynx so you can cough it out. So the mucus is necessary for trapping the dirt and other particles, but also if you have too much of this mucus, it can be a symptom that you're getting sick. So you get you have the phlegm and it can build up, so you don't want that either. So it's like too much of a good thing, so your brain will then tell your system to cough it out or sneeze it out. Okay, the diaphragm. Okay, so we just talked about the diaphragm in the previous one. It's a strong wall of muscle. The alveoli, this is the star of the respiratory system. These are the air sacs. They're tiny, tiny microscopic air sac, and these are the destination of the air that we breathe in. So these tiny air sacs are basically the ones that bring in the O2 and bring these oxygen into the bloodstream. They're very thin, they're very small, and diffusion does it all. The oxygen will go from the alveoli into the neighboring blood. The bloodstream then will take it into every single cell of the body to be circulated by the circulatory system. Now think about that for a second. If we don't have alveoli, if these lungs are one big balloon, and as you breathe in, you have to fill the whole lungs, why is that not good compared to having millions and millions of tiny air sacs? Well, as you breathe in, the airs will go into the tiny alveoli, and they're very small. So every single one of them will be able to diffuse into the surrounding bloodstream. The blood will then carry the oxygen into every single cell in your body. So there is an advantage of having the small, tiny air sacs as opposed to one big balloon lung. And also, what if you get punctured? If one of the lungs get punctured, if you have a hole, then the air will just leak out, and the entire lung is rendered useless. That would be sudden death if the entire lung just collapses because there's one tiny hole in the lung. Whereas having the different lobes also is another advantage. So let's say there's a disease of the lung, let's say cancer or emphysema or any other disease, or a person gets injured where there's now a hole in this lobe of the lung. Well, you still have the other ones that will do the breathing and respiration for us. And also, these are separate. These lobes are completely separate. They're like little compartments. So if one lobe is damaged, the air is not going to leak because the other ones are separate from that damaged lobe. Let's say this lobe is damaged here. And also, if the alveoli gets damaged by, let's say, cancer or smoking, just one puff of cigarette will actually do a lot of damage on your cilia, your phlegm, your mucus, and the alveoli itself. So if those tiny little microscopic alveoli get damaged, then the entire lung can, most of the lungs can still function because they're completely separate from each other. It's like if you have a building and each room is fireproof and one room is on fire because the doors are and the walls are enclosed, then the fire will stay in that wall, in that room, and the other ones can actually be prevented from burning. Whereas if there's no wall or separation, one big room, if a fire starts in that, then the whole thing will become smoky and damage and possibly burn into flames. So there's advantage to having small alveoli. Capillaries are the tiny blood vessels that will then bring in the oxygen by diffusion. So the alveoli here is lined with capillaries, and those capillaries are the ones that will collect the oxygen from the alveoli by diffusion. Once the cells are have taken in the oxygen, so I'm gonna just so here is one alveoli. Okay, so one alveoli here. Let's say the oxygen is brought in, so you breathe in the oxygen. The capillaries that surround this network of capillaries here, these are tubes of capillaries that are blood vessels. So these capillaries then will collect the oxygen. So the oxygen then will go through the capillaries into the arteries and bring it to the cell. On the other hand, when the cell is done with in terms of cellular respiration, recall that CO2 is the product of this process. So once the cell takes in the oxygen, burns up the glucose, produces ATP, the carbon dioxide needs to return into the capillary that surround the alveoli, and this CO2 then will enter the alveoli and out as you exhale. And so that is done by the process of diffusion. Capillaries are very, very thin, and so are the alveoli are very thin as well. So they can just be sitting next to each other and the gas will diffuse in and out because it's one cell layer thick, very thin. All right, so naturally breathing movements are involuntary. Thank goodness. We don't have to think about breathing. They proceed without thinking about it. Can you imagine you fall asleep and you're not thinking of breathing? We stop breathing. So that would be disastrous. Breathing continues when a person is sleeping or unconscious. This is necessary because the body does not store oxygen. So the oxygen actually flows in and out. So you need to continuously bring in the oxygen and bring out the CO2. So a moment's stopping of breathing can be lethal. And in most cases, for most people, 3 minutes of no breathing can actually kill the brain cells. The brain cells use up 20% of your energy and oxygen. And so if the brain does not get the oxygen within 2 to 3 minutes, that could result in brain death. And 5 minutes, that could be lethal to the organism. It is possible to exercise voluntary control over breathing. As a matter of fact, we can control our blood pressure and our respiratory rate by breathing. We can slow it down, we can hold it, we can speed up our breathing. We can breathe deeply, we can breathe shallow, but involuntary control will take over because we can't control the breathing all the time. So it is a it consists of two processes, inspiration and expiration. So the cell, so here is the cell. The breathing in, of course, in the process of, there are 3 stages. So the external respiration, internal respiration, and the cellular respiration. So I'm going to bring it into the cellular respiration here. The oxygen needs to be brought into the cell in the process of inspiration. So inspiration is also the same as inhalation, although inhalation is really the process of breathing in from the external environment and into the lungs. And of course, the CO2 would be the expiration, and this is done in the process of exhalation, breathing out. So the diaphragm is dome shaped like this. It's shaped like that. So when you are breathing in, the diaphragm gets flatter. It flattens down or moves down to make room for the expansion of the lungs. And then it becomes more of a concave. It moves upwards when you're breathing in to push the lungs upwards so it can squeeze the air out as you breathe out. And that is the process of inhalation and expiration.